Welcome to our latest Book Reporter Talks to interview with Kate Elizabeth Russell, the author of My Dark Vanessa. I first read this book last summer, right after Book Expo, as it was selected as one of the Book Expo buzz titles. And I loved hearing her talking about it at an event where the authors were able to go in and talk about their books. And it stayed with me. And as a result, I'm so glad that I'm going to be able to share an interview with you, with her today, because she has so much to share about this book. So welcome, Kate. It's so nice to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful.
So My Dark Vanessa centers around a 15-year-old girl who becomes entangled in an affair with Jacob Strain, her 42-year-old teacher. So let's start out by your just setting the stage and telling us a little bit about My Dark Vanessa.
Sure. So the novel opens when the protagonist, Vanessa Y, is 32 in fall 2017. And she discovers right in the opening chapter that this teacher, who she believes she had a consensual and loving relationship with starting when she was 15, has been accused of sexual abuse by another former student. And this accusation, it basically turns her world upside down. And the novel then moves back in time to the 2000s when she meets this teacher. And the novel sort of shows how that relationship started and how it continues, as well as the fallout from this accusation in 2017.
You know, it was so interesting because when I first was reading the book, I was back in her head when she was so young, and she was being so influenced by this man. And we're going to delve into that. But it's when I started thinking about it, I understood that you started writing this book when you were about 16 years old, and you kept writing it over and over, and everybody kept telling you you were too young to write about it. And you kept doing it for so many years. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I found that fascinating when we were talking last year.
Yeah. So I started really working with these characters when I was 16. And, looking back, it's sort of clear to me now that I didn't have a handle on the material. The material was so complex, and I understood that at that age. Like, I understood the complexity of it, but I didn't totally understand how to get that on the page. So I kept working at it, trying different forms, different points of view. The setting changed a lot, but the thing that changed the most over the years of the writing process was my understanding of the material from a really complicated and dark love story, which is how I understood it when I was young, to a story about trauma and about manipulation. And it wasn't really until, I'd say, like my late mid-20s that that shift took place in my mind. It was really a matter of discovering critical trauma theory and seeing how Vanessa's character fits so well into these symptoms of especially prolonged trauma. And yeah, it was a really long writing process, long and meandering and full of a lot of failed drafts.
Yeah, it was. And did you ever think about abandoning it all the way? Because it's clear that you had such a passion for this project. Did you ever sit there and say, oh, you know what, I don't know if I can do this anymore? Or were you continuing to say, I'm going to look at this from a different direction?
I was so obsessed with the story and with the characters that it never really occurred to me to try to stop. But I definitely made peace with the idea of not ever getting it published. Especially, I finished the final draft of My Dark Vanessa when I was in a PhD program. And I went into that PhD program figuring like, well, this is a decent way to get a book written because they won't give you the degree unless you write a dissertation, right? So I was sort of writing it in that context, but I didn't have any, confidence really that even once I finished it as a dissertation, that I would then be able to sort of make the leap into getting it accepted by a publisher and sort of finding a home in that way. So I never gave up on the idea of writing it, but I certainly gave up on the idea of it sort of entering into the world in the way that it actually did.
Yeah, so interesting. There are two different time frames in the book, the 2000 and 2017. Was one easier to write than the other? I mean, when you first started writing this, it wasn't 2017. You know,
Right.
it was a much earlier.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, I'd have to say that the past narrative was harder just because it was longer and I worked on it for so many years. But at the same time, that present day narrative that ended up being set in 2017, so bef- it was a weird situation when I was writing that narrative. I was finishing it up in 2017, in fall 2017, when Me Too started happening. And so it had initially been set in 2015 because I liked the sort of neat math of that, like 2000, 2015. But then once Me Too started happening, I sort of shifted gears a little bit and set it in 2017. But that timeline was hard. It was really hard because um, I mean, I was dealing with these sort of questions of complicity and victimhood that are sort of inherently difficult. But then also, Vanessa's character at 32, I kind of had to figure her out because I felt like I really knew her as a teenager.
Mhm.
But at 32, you know, there's this span of 10 years from about age 22 to 32 that we don't see in the novel. And so who she ended up as at 32 was something that I really had to figure out because her life could have veered off in any number of directions. So figuring out like her job, her circumstances in life, if she was in a relationship, if she was happy, like all of those things I had to sort of unearth about her. So that was difficult in a different way, I guess.
Because you had to piece together who she was during
Mhm.
all this time to get to this next place. Like you knew her as a teenager, you
Right.
knew what she was going through, you knew some of the ramifications of that. But it's such a long time period of those 17 years.
Mhm.
So much could happen to her in between. And I think you did a good job of talking about how she was lost a lot during that time
Right.
and really, you know, trying to find who she was and what she was. But yes, I agree that had to have been challenging.
Yeah.
Making a lot of her. We see Vanessa struggle to see the story of her life for the tragedy it truly is. Was it tough writing the tragic parts of it?
Yes, it was, but at the same time, you know, some I've had these moments of picking up the book and rereading certain things, especially like the scene where the first night that she spends at Strain's house. That's a really, really difficult scene to read. And I feel like it's harder for me to read it than it was for me to write it because when I was writing it, I was so in Vanessa's point of view. And in these scenes, especially the scenes of abuse, she is sort of skimming along the surface, right? She knows what's going on and she sees these glimpses into what's quote unquote really happening, but she won't let herself totally go there. And because the book is written in such a close first person point of view, I felt like I was in the same way, sort of skimming the surface. So it's this weird experience now of revisiting certain parts of the book and almost being horrified by my own writing. So it's interesting looking back on the writing process like that. Like, was I fully aware of what I was writing? Like, I must have been, but at the same time, like, I was so focused on Vanessa that I think I had blinders on in a way similar to what she, you know, is feeling.
I think it's one of the things that makes the book so powerful, actually. And she writes scenarios with Mr. Strain in her head. She manipulates to see him. And like not someone her own age. She is really obsessed with this man. And that's very much coming forth in the book because it's not just him. It's not just a one-sided thing. It's
Right.
her definitely forcing the game forward as well. At any time she could stop the game. And I think when you're writing about her in 2000, you're doing such a good job of realizing we know that that was not the right thing to be doing, but she really saw she was doing an end game that she wanted to do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and she feels so driven towards him, and at no point does she really start to question like, oh, this is wrong. She understands that the world sees it as wrong, but it never feels that way to her, and she's so driven by emotion and desire that that's all she cares about, and she gets so focused on him that yeah, she's a character that I don't think she would have listened to anyone, or like to telling her that this was a bad idea, which is frustrating, I think, to read, but at the same time can be incredibly compelling because she's a character who is so driven.
But I think that we also are thinking about young women who do get into these situations.
Mhm.
And for reading her and reading the power of the way she was feeling this way, you can understand how people get caught up in situations that they cannot get out of because
Right.
they're, the goal to them is the wrong goal, but it is the goal and they can't turn away from it.
Mhm.
And I thought it was, so then he shares Lolita with her. And do you recall reading that book for the first time and what that was like as an experience for you?
Absolutely. Yes. So I read Lolita for the first time when I was 14, and I sought it out myself. No one gave it to me. But when I first read it, I fell in love with that novel in a way that I had never fell in love with a book before. Like I'd been reading like adult literature for a few years, but that was one of the first novels I read that really spoke to me as an aspiring writer. And I thought, like, oh my God, if I could write like this, my life would be perfect. But I was also a 14-year-old girl reading Lolita. And so I saw myself in the novel. I saw sort of these traces of how the world seemed to work in the novel. Like I felt like at the time reading it, I felt like that novel gave me insight into the male psyche, which is so cringy and sort of heartbreaking to look back on. But that's truly how I felt at the time because I saw evidence of that dynamic of older men or just the world at large sexualizing girls my age. I saw that everywhere, everywhere,
Mhm.
especially once I'd read Lolita. I saw traces of it everywhere in the culture I was growing up in. And so I I thought this was how the world worked. I thought this is how men think. This is what heterosexuality is. It was really, really formative for me, and I understand why. As problematic as that is, it made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and as a result, I feel that the voice, because of your experience with that, is so well done in this book. Did it take you time to develop the voice of Vanessa, or was it always coming to you?
She, I would say a little bit of, but like in a certain sense, I feel like she came to me fully formed. And there is a lot of me in Vanessa. There's also a lot of my friends in her. Um, so I feel like I always understood her, but at the same time, it took me a while to land on or get the decision right to write her from that really close first person point of view because I was discouraged from writing from her perspective over the years. And even when I did write from her perspective, it was usually in the third person. I felt like I got a lot of feedback that suggested that a first person narration from this character wouldn't be enough to hold up a book, or it wouldn't be relatable enough to readers. It couldn't do the work. But on the other hand, I got a lot of encouragement to write from the teacher's point of view, which to a certain extent makes sense because I think that's maybe a more familiar model to get a story like this because it's the Lolita model. It's the Humbert Humbert
Right.
narration. Yeah.
Yeah, but I just felt that the way her voice, her desperation, her seeking him out, and the way that she was ignoring everyone else her age, every
Mhm.
place she would go. And it was sort of like, even if there was a boy that was attracted to her, she wasn't going to care. Her
Mhm.
views were someplace else. And it's got a lot to do with what was going on in her personal life at the time. But for everything that she was shunning about the rest of the world, she was single minded on where she was going. And I think that's the reason she's written so well, because it's not like girlfriends were telling her to do something else and she was going to do it.
Right.
It was,
Right.
she wasn't going to look at something. The fact that it takes place at a boarding school, I also think gives you a locked in place to be
Mhm.
writing the story. She's not having the outside influence of parents. In fact, whenever she does something, she's telling them she's going someplace else and she's not doing that.
Right.
So I think that the boarding school setup was, just perfect. Was it always set there?
It wasn't. No. The decision to set it at a boarding school came like fairly late in the writing process. It was maybe around like 2016 that I decided to set it at a boarding school. Before that, it had been at sort of a ordinary public high school. But the decision to set it at the boarding school came partly out of just a craft decision, because I kept coming up against this problem of how would this relationship between her and Strain continue sort of unfettered when she was going home to her parents every day,
Mhm.
and
Exactly.
having
Yep.
to, have that deception be a daily thing. And around that same time, I read Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld for the first time. And the boarding school in that novel is just like so well done that I started to think about the idea of setting it there. And then I also started to read a lot of news stories about cases of sexual abuse at private schools sort of coming to light. The Boston Globe Spotlight team did a big report, I think in 2015 or 2016 on that. And it all just kind of made sense to move the setting to a boarding school. And it was also, it was really enjoyable to create a fictional boarding school and to create that campus. I always say, like, writing this novel, I wouldn't describe it as like a fun writing process, right? Because the material is so heavy, but creating a fictional campus was a little bit of fun.
Yeah, and what happened there is because so much of it's just the kids involved with kids. The outside influences of adults are mostly about academics. It is not about overseeing every single second of your life. It's not you sitting at the dinner table and your parents going, what is going on with her? Her
Right.
friends are in their own orbits. Their friends are chasing the boys in the school in their own way, and they're just not seeing things the same way. And I think that that's one of the reasons that the boarding school setting works so well, because there are people that just didn't care about what Vanessa was doing. They were so obsessed with their own lives. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Was the writing and rewriting difficult? Was it hard to do this for such a long period of time?
I wouldn't say it was difficult. It was more like I almost got, I think, addicted to revising and rewriting. And looking back now, it's easy for me to say, like, oh, it was all, sort of meant to be, like it was all the right decision. Like all those times that I decided to take the working draft that I had and rip it apart and start from scratch. But yeah, I sort of got in this mode, at least for a few years, where I felt like I had to get the beginning right. And so I felt like I kept rewriting the beginning over and over again. And that's not a very efficient way to write. So in that, I'm hoping, as I very slowly start work on book 2, that I've sort of gotten that out of my system, or at least learned a lesson that it's better to always be moving forward. I'm like, it's like a shark, right? Sharks are always swimming. They're always moving forward. I'm trying to like have that visualization as I write now.
Yeah, just keep writing. We can always change it later.
Right,
Just keep moving
exactly.
in the right direction. But I think that I think we're working so hard to make sure the story's set up well. And I think the reason it works so well is because the setup at the beginning is so strong. And if
Mm-hmm.
you didn't have that, you could have gotten lost in the weeds as time went on. Exploring the issues of abuse and consent can be such a fine line. And I felt like you walked it so well in the book, because there was consent from her, though
Mm-hmm.
it shouldn't have been. So we're looking at consent in a different way. So let's talk about that a little bit, because it was not like she was saying no. She was
Right.
giving many green lights, and though it was wrong, what was really happening?
Right. Yeah. The way I feel like, so I came of age in like the 90s and the early aughts. I was born in 1984, and the way that I was taught about consent was no means no and yes means yes, and there wasn't a lot of nuance brought into that conversation. And so I wanted Vanessa to have sort of learned and internalized the same lessons that I did. And I wanted the book to show the inadequacy of teaching consent in that way. I remember reading a essay by this feminist scholar named, I think her name's Linda Martin Alcoff, and she posed this question. This was published in like 2018, I think, but she posed this question like, "Are you allowed to change your mind?" are you allowed to look back on an experience of sexual violence that at the time you didn't classify as sexual violence, but now, however long, you know, after that had passed, whether it's days, weeks, or years, are you allowed to go back and change your mind? And that's a really tough question, because I think so often when we start asking a question like that, like, are you allowed to change your mind? We sort of immediately jump into this framework of the law, or like, well, if you change your mind and you decide that you didn't consent, then it becomes like a legal issue, because as soon as we start talking about rape, we start talking about what it means in the legal sense. And so I tried to, when I was writing this, I tried to keep the ideas of criminality and the law sort of kept at a distance, because it felt right for the book, because Vanessa was never going to, you know, sort of go that way. And Strain definitely was working. He works throughout the novel to keep Vanessa away from thinking of anything that he does to her in terms of crime. But I felt that by keeping that framework far away from what I was working with allowed me some more freedom to let Vanessa move between, maybe I said yes, or maybe I said yes but I didn't mean it, and maybe these memories mean something really different to me now. And it also allowed me to not come up with a definitive answer. And that was really, really important. Because again, it felt right for the story, it felt right for her character, but also I think that's a much more interesting reading experience for the reader to read a story like this and to not be told what to feel.
Yeah, because this is not what just happens to a girl at the hands of a teacher. It's a much larger systematic, emblematic of what's abuse. What is
Right.
abuse? And you're seeing it through her eyes, but it's a much bigger story than, because these other people are now coming forth. And now I could just picture this girl questioning, but wait a second, that with me was love. Like,
Right.
wait, he loved me. And that has to be a horribly tragic situation. And I don't think that this is a character that is not what's happening to other people in these situations, of saying, wait, that wasn't what was going on with me. For me, oh, it was love. It was different.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot, I mean, I think Vanessa, she's, you know, she's clinging to these ideas of her own agency, her own willingness, her own sort of what she sees as her humanity, you know, and because to her, if she says, oh yes, that was rape or that was abuse, then she suddenly loses all sense of self, all sense of agency. And there's also this sort of deeper emotional loss at the thought of her being just another victim, because so much of what she loved about Strain was that feeling of being special and being
Yes.
put on a pedestal. And that's there's a huge loss in that.
Was he hard to develop, or did he, because he's so multidimensional as well. He's got this evil side of him. He's got this side where he's loving towards her. Was it rough writing a character like that?
He changed so much over the course of the writing process. You know, for many years when I was younger and writing him, he was sort of this just this conflicted man, right? That he wanted to do the right thing and he was very resistant. And I would say that Vanessa in those early drafts was even more of the instigator, right? But then once I sort of started reading more about trauma theory, and the shape of the novel shifted when I was in my late 20s, Strain became a lot more sinister and almost like scary. And it was easier in a lot of ways to write him that way because he was just sort of a one-dimensional villain. And I didn't feel like obligated to give him depth just for the sake of giving him depth. But it got to the point where I started to realize that by flattening him, I was really cheating Vanessa out of her own complexity. Because if she was so focused on this character, on this man who was so obviously bad, the reader would have a harder time relating to her, understanding her. So I knew that I had to give him enough depth and enough complexity that the reader would understand why he's so compelling to her. So everything, I really feel like the way that I characterized him was all in service of her. She was just so central to everything in my writing process that I really let her guide me in that way.
Yeah. And I think that it was, you had to make Vanessa likable. And it
Yep.
was, to make Vanessa likable, you had to really change who he was, because we wanted to, you wanted to have us sympathizing with her. And in order to do that, he had to become a lot more one-dimensional. He had to
Yep.
become a lot more like, it's just bad. It's just bad. You did a lot of research for this book, a lot of reading. So what can you share about like why the research and reading became important to you? Because I felt that by doing it, you gave a much, not academic, but a much full, richer experience of what was going on for everyone. But you just stop writing to read?
Yeah, it's like, I remember I had a professor during my MFA who he said, the trope you're working with is very familiar. It's been done many, many times before. And I remember he said, like, what you really need to do is become a master of this trope. And I took that to heart, and I tried to read as much as I could about certainly like age gap relationships. But then once I started thinking of this more in terms of trauma, I started to read everything I could about sexual abuse, whether it be other novels or like poetry collections, drama, memoir, but also a lot of academic texts. And also for, the last 5 years of the writing process, I was in a PhD program. And so I had to be reading. And I was expected to be able to sort of make the case for why this novel I was writing was academically relevant, and also how it fit into this larger conversation, which is, what you have to do no matter what your field is in academics. But that was what I was trying to do, was to sort of identify the literary and cultural landscape that I felt like this novel was speaking to. And so a lot about narratives of sexual violence, but also looking at the culture of the late 90s and the early 2000s. I tried to bring that in as well. And that shows up in a lot of cultural references in the novel.
I was smiling over the fact that you were writing this when you're doing your PhD program. When I was in college, I took a number of creative writing courses. I always loved to write. I haven't written in a long time, but write a lot of newsletters and I write a lot of author interviews, but not a lot of this. And it was funny because there was this story about this girl from, I just remember the character's name was Adair, and she was driving from New York to Washington. And I had the same professor a number of times. And I walked in this class, I took it as screenwriting, short story writing enough. And he looks at me and he goes, Adair cannot drive to Washington with the windshield wipers as a metaphor for her crying again in this class. And I was like, but that was like so good. And he just looked at me and he goes, Adair has to do something else this marking period. So when I was thinking about you writing this for 5 years, I was thinking about my 4 years of college. And I've got that story someplace. I've got to go find it and figure out exactly what was going on with my metaphor of the windshield wipers and Adair crying. I thought, I just figured you'd get a kick out of that. Like, after all this time of like, writing away. There's so many layers in your storytelling. And do you think today's young women have a different frame of reference and a different viewpoint about sexuality and about these situations? Or do you think that they are still prey to the same kinds of things that we were seeing through the years? Has there been a maturity?
I mean, I think, and a lot of this can be sort of summed up as post Me Too, but I think the conversation started to change before Me Too, more like in the past 10 years. I think there's been an increased awareness in sort of the ways that these sort of sexual manipulation and coercion can be so subtle and so it can be disguised so easily as things like love or at the very least normalized. And I do feel like Me Too has given an awareness of the prevalence of these things, and also, and this is really important, maybe the most important thing in my mind, a shared vocabulary, where we've started to see terms like rape culture, or even like a term like grooming, become almost mainstream, where we have a sort of collective understanding of what that means. And that's huge. That's huge. Like growing up, I don't think ever heard the term grooming. I didn't understand like what it was or what it looked like. And in the novel, certainly that's what, Vanessa doesn't see what's happening to her at 15 was strained as grooming, and as a 32-year-old, when she hears that word, she really struggles to understand what that might mean.
Yeah, and I think she struggles to understand that did she do something wrong at that point? She's actually
Right.
looking at herself as, wait a second, was I wrong? And for a long time, it's got to go back to the blame on him, because she didn't see herself as doing anything wrong. And
Right.
she's still trying to support him
Mhm.
because she thought it was love. Your journey to getting published was quite interesting, especially since I loved hearing you started this at 16. I mean, it's a really long time to be writing a story. What was it like getting an agent? What was it like, finally finish the MFA. You're out of finally writing this piece. The book is done. Then what happens?
Yeah, so I started querying agents when I felt like I had a finished draft that I felt confident in. It wasn't perfect, but I felt good about it. And then it took 5 months of pretty much constant querying. And I know exactly how many I sent because I kept a spreadsheet. So I queried 66 agents before I got
Wow.
an offer. And it didn't surprise me that it took that long. I was sort of, expecting it because I'd heard, from a lot of other writers who had gone through that process that it can take a really long time. And then my agent and we worked on it a little bit. We did like one light edit before we sent it to editors. And I expected it to take a similarly long time once it was submitted to editors, but it sold within like 48 hours. And then
Mhm.
day after it sold in the US, it sold in the UK. And then the day after that, I think, was the first foreign rights deal. So it happened really, really, really quickly. And it still shocks me that it happened that way. But it hit at a certain moment. And
Mhm.
I think people were really excited about finding a novel that dealt with the subject material, but that was really propulsive and written in really accessible prose. It sort of hit that sweet spot.
And it was a different kind of a story too.
Yeah.
It was a story that took place over such a long frame of work of time. And I think that the fact that this woman is now seeing herself differently
Yeah.
was something that was different about the book. It's not like it was just this one time period or a young woman just sitting and going, oh, so I can now go after so and so. This
Right.
was
Right.
still troubled because she was sitting there like, wait a second, I still want to see him. I still want to have him on my side. And that was not the narrative that a lot of people were
No,
talking about at this point
no.
at all. And I
Right.
think that's what made the story so strong, because everybody is, men are wrong, women are right. This is the way it's going to
Mhm.
be. And instead, this woman was saying, well, maybe he's right and I'm right. And maybe this is the way we feel. And I think that it was a fresh look because we'd gone to everything being so black and so white. And
Mhm.
I mean, I have a number of people that I know who are men who are going, what did I do wrong somewhere along the way? Did I do something wrong? And
Right.
it was a question of what the time was then. It was completely different, you know?
Right. Right. And I don't think I would have, yeah, I don't think I would have been able to write this book if I hadn't been working on it for such a long time, because
Mhm.
it did feel risky to a certain degree, putting it out in the world right now. But at the same time, I think people are responding to the nuance and the difficulty of it, which is heartening.
And has there been a different reaction around the world? Like, I know it's been published in the US. Has it been published around the world simultaneously, or you want a delay on those?
Not yet. It's sort of slowly coming out. So the UK publication date is next week. And then I think, well, it's out in Dutch already. And then I think it's going to come out like in the Scandinavian countries next. And then so it'll slowly start trickling out. And yeah, I'm excited to see.
I'm excited to see how the different cultures react as
Yeah.
well. I'm going to keep in touch with you about that because I'm just wondering how people are going to feel about this. Um, Do you think that this novel can make it easier to have these conversations about abuse? I figure book clubs, having a conversation, people can bring up incidents that happened to them that may have been much more subliminal than this, but things that happened to them through the years that you don't really think about until you start reading a book like this.
Yeah, that's my hope. That's my hope, both in what the reading of the novel might sort of bring up, but also I think fiction can be so effective in that a conversation that starts about the characters, about this fictional story, can I think really easily, sort of seamlessly transition into a story about our own experiences, and it can be a less intimidating entry point, especially if you have, you know, if you're not sure about an experience that you had and how you feel about it, how you felt about it then, how you feel about it now. Here's this character, Vanessa, who certainly doesn't know. I think that can be really helpful.
I think it's be a good catalyst for conversation for people. I really do. The other thing I just love is the cover. So can we talk a little bit about how the cover came to be? Was this always the cover? I mean, it's just such a dramatic one. I'm going to come in real close on this.
Yes. So the cover, it's so funny. The first conversation that I had with my editor and agent about the cover really, really early on, like almost right after the book sold, I remember saying like, what about a black and white like photograph cover? And it was sort of like, no, that's not really the style of book covers now. I'm like, oh, okay, all right, what do I know? And then I didn't really hear anything about the cover for a few months. And then my editor came to me with this cover they'd been working on, and it was this one, and I was like, that's perfect, that's exactly what I imagined too. And so that was really reassuring. I felt like the book itself sort of led everyone in the direction that I had already envisioned, but as soon as I saw it, it's just perfect.
It has been, because it does. I'm looking at it and I'm like, you couldn't picture a different cover for the book, like
Right.
as I'm looking at it. When I read the book last summer, I knew I was going to have to reread it to be able to talk to you, because it's been such a long time and I was talking to people about the book, but it's all those little nuances and characters I want to make sure I understood. So I went and got a copy of the audio that is narrated by Grace Gummer, and I listened to that. And it's such a great experience. So were you involved with the audio? Were you able to work with her on it?
So yeah, so I first heard about the audio for, I remember I got an email from my editor, and they had a list of potential audiobook narrators, and they were asking for my input. And Grace Gummer had she had narrated a Alice Hoffman novel a few years ago, and so I was able to listen to an excerpt from that. And as soon as I heard it, I was like, this is Vanessa. And I'd seen her too in like the film Frances Ha, and she'd been in the series The Newsroom. So I was sort of familiar with her as an actress as well. And I was like, oh, please, like if she's available, if she'll do it, that would be perfect. And she was. And so then I didn't really hear much about the audio book recording process until after it was done, and I went to New York to do an interview, and then I also on that trip was able to sit down and have a conversation with my editor Jessica and with Grace, and that's it's sort of bonus content at the end of the audiobook, where we talk about, like I talk about the writing process, and then Grace talks about the process of doing the audiobook. And it was so interesting because she talked a lot about like getting into the character and the process of recording. And she recorded it all in chronological order. And so the novel goes back and forth, but she sort of recorded it straight through because her voice changes. You know, at 15, her voice is so much lighter and higher. And then as Vanessa gets older throughout the course of the story, you can really hear it in the way that Grace narrates, which is the benefit of having an incredible actress do the audiobook for your novel. I feel so fortunate.
I felt like the beginning where, and now it's interesting to hear that that's what she did. To the beginning, the sections in 2000, Vanessa's got a sort of sense of wonder in her voice. She's got this definite youngness to her voice. And then when you're listening to the others, there's this questioning to her voice, which is completely different tone. And as a result, you can feel the tension in the two different parts of the books just by the way she's saying it. And it's just this little nuance that I'm picking up in her voice as I was hearing her speaking, this questioning.
Yeah,
So
yeah. She does such a great job with that, and such a great job with other characters as well. Like with she has a voice for Strain, and she explained that she wanted his voice to be sort of really loud and sort of take up a lot of space to reflect sort of how much space his character takes up in Vanessa's mind. And then there's another character later on in the novel as a college professor who comes from Texas, and Grace gave him a Texan drawl that like I wasn't totally expecting, but as soon as I heard it, I was like, oh my God, that's perfect. It's just so, so, so well done.
I have not yet listened to the end where you do the interview with your editor, and I'm really looking forward to hearing that as well, because I think that sometimes the editor author process is such an interesting process of working back and forth, because even though the book was delivered finished, it's then how do we ramp it up? What are little nuances that she wants to put? And I'm dying to hear, because I know that you two had a very close relationship in working on this book. And I think that was one of the things that made the book a stronger book.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's Jessica's level of investment in this novel. It still just like blows me away. She like from the very first phone call with her, it was just this book, you know, it was obviously, you know, had been under my skin for like 18 years, but I feel like as soon as she read it, it sort of like got into her core in a way that I just feel so lucky to have an editor who sort of is so invested in my work.
Yeah. And congratulations on your success hitting the New York Times list 2 weeks in a
Yeah.
row. I mean, it's just like a great, like out of the gate, especially when things are so complicated with book sales right now. I love seeing that. Really did.
Yeah, and even the indies, like the indie bookstores, they're still doing a lot of online ordering, and they're still holding strong. So things feel good despite everything.
You know, and it's funny because no matter how much is going on that you can't do, we're hearing from a lot of readers that they're reading more than before. They are
Right.
getting books. They are ordering books. And let's say there's no sports. There's not a lot of other things you can do right now. And people are enjoying the opportunity to be able to escape with a book. So I think that's wonderful. So are you working on anything now? Because after all, you can't go get another MFA. Well, maybe you could, but you know.
I won't.
I don't think you need to pay to write another book. You know?
No. I am, and I'm really superstitious, so I keep not calling it a book. I call it a project. It'll be further along when I feel like really confident enough to call it a book. But yeah, I was worried. I was really worried about the idea of working on something else, because I worked on My Dark Vanessa for so long. It's like, would I be able to do it? Not would I be able to write more, but would I be able to have the same like interest level and investment in a new idea to get a novel out of it? But I kind of do. I'm really hesitant. Like, I don't want to spook my own creativity and my own interest, but I feel really invested in this character, invested in the themes that I'm working with. And oddly enough, well, certainly the whole publication process, but even now in this crazy sort of cooped up world that we're living in right now, these things sort of feed into the themes of this new idea I'm working with. So I'm trying to take advantage of that. And I know I sound cryptic right now, but that's the like superstitious part of me who don't want to talk about it too much, but it's all in here and it feels good.
I never ask. It's funny. I have so many author friends that I've known. I mean, I've been doing this for 24 years. And people say, you never ask what the book's about. And I said, when you're ready, you'll tell me. Right. And I said, I just feel that and a lot of people will start prying and whatever. And I always say, when you're ready, send it to me and I'll be happy to give you a look and give you feedback. But I feel like writing is such a private experience in so many ways for an author. And I know people that have written novels and they said they've written them 3 times. I mean, I remember talking to Tayari Jones about that. And she said she came to it from 3 different points of view before she realized she was going to write from all 3. Right. And I think that the writing process is so much like that. And you saw how this book developed over the years for taking the time to do it. Right. And it would have been a very different book when you were 16 years old. It would have been a very, very different kind of a book. Well, I am so glad that we have My Dark Vanessa to share with our readers. I so appreciate your taking the time to talk to us today. And so look forward to seeing what you do next.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This was a wonderful conversation.
Okay, and to our readers, we look forward to our next Book Reporter Talks to interview coming to you from my dining room. Because after all, I'm not entertaining anytime soon. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.